when I mean by anti-blackness, it is the fear coursing through American society that defines Black people as dangerous, as a threat, as an entity that needs to be contained and subjugated. And so we see this in the legislation coming out, barring Black people from being able to have access to guns. We see it in the South, where you have massive slavery, but we also see it in the North, where you have slavery as well.
What's up, YouTube family? So on today's video, we'll be talking about the Second Amendment in the USA. And as you all know, the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution is part of the Bill of Rights, which was ratified on December 15th of 1971. And the amendment reads that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And this interpretation of the Second Amendment has been a subject of debate for many years. There are many perspectives in regards to this amendment, the Second Amendment. And on today's video, there is none other than the professor herself, Carol Anderson, trying to uncover the details of this Second Amendment. Let us learn together as Carol Anderson educates us on the details of this Second Amendment. Let's watch this video.
Well, we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll start at the beginning, where you begin with a story of Philando Castile as an example of how the Second Amendment has failed Black people. Remind us of what happened in that case.
So Philando Castile was a Black man and in Minnesota, and the police had pulled him over. And when the police officer asked to see ID, Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerted the officer that he had a license to carry weapon with him, but that he was reaching for his ID as the officer had asked. And from that, the officer began shooting and killed Philando Castile. We saw the video images, this broadcast. He was killed because he had a gun, not that he was brandishing a weapon, not that he was threatening anyone, simply because he had a licensed weapon. I was stunned about the virtual silence of the NRA in that. Because this is the NRA that is the champion of the Second Amendment. This is the NRA that called after Ruby Ridge and after Waco, called federal officers jackbooted government thugs for killing law-abiding citizens and breaking into their homes and taking their weapons. And these were actually folks who had shot at federal officers and killed some. But you get virtual silence from the NRA at this. And journalists began asking, well, do African Americans have Second Amendment rights? And I went, wow, that is a great question. And that's what got me started on this hunt.
So on the back cover of the book says the Second Amendment isn't about guns, it is about anti-blackness. And then you go back 400 years to begin to make your case for that argument. And I do want to rewind from the Philando Castile story and go back to the 1600s, because you say that there were deliberate legislative efforts in the North as well as in the South to make sure that Black people, enslaved or free, did not have access to guns. What was that all about?
And so when I mean by anti-blackness, it is the fear coursing through American society that defines Black people as dangerous, as a threat, as an entity that needs to be contained and subjugated. And so we see this in the legislation coming out, barring Black people from being able to have access to guns. We see it in the South, where you have massive slavery, but we also see it in the North, where you have slavery as well, which is one of the things that we really don't understand, is that the colonies had slavery. In New York, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, in Massachusetts, slavery. And you had legislation, for instance, barring Black people from joining the militia in the North, because there was the fear of Black people with guns. And this is in the 1600s. You have the legislation coming in the South about Black people cannot have access to guns. And this is because of the massive fear of slave revolts, that there will be retribution, that if they get their hands on weapons, they will kill us. And so you get this legislation. And so with each revolt, with each rumor of a revolt, you start getting the architecture of control being put in place. These laws, but also slave patrols that go into slave cabins and monitor and looking for contraband and monitor the movements of the enslaved people, but also the militia. And the militia are there to control, to put down slave revolts.
I want to talk about the militia, because the militia was supposed to have a number of different purposes, including repelling a foreign invasion and so forth. But you make the case that it wasn't really about that the purpose of the militia was much more about slavery.
Yes. And so the militia's role, today we get this narrative of the militia as this heroic force that repelled the British and fought for American liberty and freedom and justice. But during the War for Independence, the militia, sometimes they show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they fight, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they take off running. George Washington was beside himself at the unreliability of the militia in terms of fending off a professional army. And you had Gouverneur Morris out of New York saying that to rely upon the militia to fend off a foreign invasion is like depending upon a broken reed. They knew that the militia could not do this work. They had proven it repeatedly. We also get this issue of the militia as this force for domestic tyranny, fending off domestic tyranny. But we had Shays' Rebellion right before the Constitutional Convention. And Shays' Rebellion, where we're in a group of white men in Massachusetts, were angry about taxation policy and the foreclosure of land, the seizure of land for non-payment of taxes. So they attacked the Massachusetts government. And they were on their way to the armory. Massachusetts tries to call out the militia to control Shays' Rebellion. The militia were like, no, I'm not feeling that. And then there were members of the militia actually joined Shays' Rebellion. And so it required Boston merchants to fund a mercenary army to put down Shays' Rebellion. So the reliability of the militia was really in doubt. What the militia could really do consistently was to put down slave revolts. That was a key function for the militia.
Family, I really like how Professor Carol Anderson talks about this issue of the Second Amendment. She makes it really clear, and I am learning a lot. In her conversation, the first thing that she mentions is the incident of Philando Castile. Philando Castile was a black man who was driving. Then the police stopped him and asked him to give them his identity, his ID card. But he declared and said that he had a licensed gun in the car, but the police proceeded to shoot him severely and he died at the spot. That just shows us why this Second Amendment is not working for the black people in the USA. This shows us how rotten the US is, especially with the white cops who think that black people are just a threat to them, you know. And this is just showing, this just brings about the question, are the black people a part of the Second Amendment? Do African Americans have a Second Amendment right? That's the question that just kickstarted this conversation. Then the professor started taking it down 400 years back and start explaining how this Second Amendment was anti-black. She goes 400 years back and starts speaking about the black enslaved couldn't have access to arms. You know, the black people in the time couldn't have access to arms. They felt like black people were a threat to them. They felt like black people were dangerous, and they ensured that black people could not access firearms. There was a lot of anti-blackness in the 1600s, you know, around the time that this bill started in the US, you know. Then black people were barred from joining the militia. Yo, this militia was only for white supremacists. They were afraid that these black people, given an opportunity to own firearms, they'd revert back and it would be a back and forth fight. So they decided that no black people would be allowed in the militia. Then they proceed, and in the 1600s, there was a lot of fear of slave revolts. You know, they were afraid that these slave revolts, given an opportunity, given firearms, they would have a lot of backlash to the white supremacists. Then around the same timing, the militia had a threat from these people who, the white people who were against some taxes. They formed a rebellion known as the Shays Rebellion, where angry people, angry white men were against some tax policies, and they wanted to reach the armory. But you know what the militia did? They were in support of the same people. They couldn't stop them from doing whatever they were doing in that time. So they had to fund machineries who had to stop these rebellion, the Shays Rebellion. This just shows us that the only work that the militia could do in that time was put down slave revolts only. The only threat to them was black people, you know. And this just shows us that the history of the Second Amendment has been absurd. It has been sad because, the only timings when these amendments can be slightly figured out differently is when we talk about the black people. Let us get back to the issue of Philando Castile. You know, he's a black man, and you wonder, does African Americans have a Second Amendment right? You know, do they really deserve to have this right like any other person? Going back 400 years ago to the Shays Rebellion, you notice once again that they'd rather not put black men in militia, but try and bring about some machinery to stop the Shays Rebellion against their fellow white men. But when it comes to black revolts, the slave revolts, the issue is different. Black men have always been feared over the years, and this is just but a proof. So guys, let us continue listening in to our professor in regards to this same issue of the Second Amendment in the US. Let's listen in.
Well, and that's also interesting because when you think about the Revolutionary War, and you write about this in the book, that the fact was there were not enough white men to really fend off the British. And there was talk about arming, black people to be part of the revolutionary force, the Continental Army. But there was a lot of resistance to that, in spite of the fact that the militias were thin, unreliable, and not really an entity that could be depended upon.
Right, absolutely. And so in 1775, basically black men have been banned from the Continental Army. But the exigencies of war and the lack of white men willing to enlist in the Continental Army finally compelled the states to begin to enlist black people. And one of the things you saw happening in the North was offering emancipation for those enslaved men who would fight for the patriots, who would fight for the rebels. You will get your freedom if you fight for us. And part of what was the tripwire for that is that the Earl of Dunmore down in Virginia had offered freedom to the enslaved of the rebels if they would come fight for the King of England, that you will get your freedom. And so you start seeing this mass movement of black folks fighting for the British, which is swelling their ranks. And you get the Continental Army going, oh, we got to do something here. We got to do something. But when the war, and so with the Continental Army, the enlistment of Black folks made that a truly integrated fighting force. And when they were a truly integrated fighting force, their resiliency stiffened, and it moved the British, it compelled the British to go south and hit what they called the soft underbelly. When they hit the soft underbelly, they took Georgia like that. Then they were headed to Charleston to take South Carolina. George Washington sends his emissary down there, John Lawrence, a son of the South, son of South Carolina, and says, look, you only have 750 white men who are eligible to fight, because South Carolina had deployed the rest of its white men as part of the militia to keep that enslaved population down. And Lawrence said, you got to arm the enslaved. There are 8,000 British troops coming. You only have 750 white men. That's a problem. And South Carolina said, no, the problem is you asking us to arm the enslaved. We are horrified. We don't even know if this is a nation worth fighting for. We would rather take our chances with the British than arm the enslaved.
You know, I was struck by the fact as I read the book, how you talked about that both in the Constitutional Convention and sort of the run-up to that, as well as 70 plus years later, the run-up to the Civil War, that really what it amounted to was that slavery was the price of unity. It was the price that was paid in both wars to kind of keep everybody together.
Yes. Yes. I mean, so one of the things that you see is with the Constitutional Convention, you have the South that wants to embed slavery, to protect slavery, strengthen the institution of slavery in the United States. And you have these Northern delegates, many of these Northern delegates who want a stronger United States of America because the Articles of Confederation just weren't working. But the South was playing basically a game of chicken, a game of hardball. And I'm mixing metaphors here, but basically saying if we don't get what we want in terms of protecting slavery, then we will walk. You will not have a United States of America. And the other delegates were so afraid of that we ended up with the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. We ended up with an expansion of 20 years on the Atlantic slave trade in the Constitution. And we ended up with the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution as the price for the South to sign on to the Constitution of the United States so that there would really be a viable United States. But what happens that gets us to the Second Amendment is that you have in the constitutional ratification conventions, it's being ratified, and then it stalls. And so Virginia is sitting there as one of the biggies that has not ratified yet. And Patrick Henry, war hero, revolutionary, right, is arguing big time that because James Madison had put control of the militia under the federal government in the Constitution, that slaveholders would be left defenseless if there was an uprising. He's like, you cannot trust the North. You know, the North detests slavery. George Mason is like, we will be left defenseless. They won't send the militia down here to protect us. They hate slavery. We will be slaughtered. We can't have this. And so they started pushing hard on Madison, basically threatening the Constitution of the United States, saying we will have a new constitutional convention if we don't get a Bill of Rights that protects us. And that Bill of Rights, so when you think about our Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right not to have cruel and unusual punishment, the rights for a well-regulated militia, for the security of the state, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. I mean, it is such an outlier. It is the same kind of outlier as the 3/5 clause because it is the bribe to the South to not scuttle the United States of America.
So family, around 1775, black men were barred from the Continental Army because they were afraid of arming these black men. They were afraid of giving these black men firearms. But around the same timing, there were not enough white men to fight the Brits who were planning to attack the USA. And from the north side of the US, they promised black men after a lot of pressure came in, because the white men were not enough to take on these Brits. So after a lot of pressure on them, they decided that, you know what, from today henceforth, we'll be taking in black men in the army. And the benefit of them getting into the army will be freedom, the enslaved black men. So after you've served in the army fighting the Brits, you'll now be free, and you'll not be enslaved again. So from these, a lot of black men were put into the army, and most of them made it difficult for the Brits to conquer the north. And now the Brits decided that it's time that they go down to the south. And in the south, the Brits go down to the south and hit Georgia. They hit Georgia immediately they get to the south. And they moved now to South Carolina. But do you know the funny thing in the south is that the white supremacists were not ready to call upon the black men to serve in the army. They were afraid of these black men. They were afraid to be taken over. So they had at least 750 white men in the militia who were planning to fight more than 8,000 British troops. That could already mean that the white folks in that time failed, in these fight, but they did not care. Their goal was to ensure that black folks were not able to get into the army. They preferred to enslave them. They preferred to take a big part of their militia to protect the enslaved black men, and offer 750 white men to fight, the 8,000 British troops. And they insisted that we cannot arm the enslaved, they were afraid. We cannot arm the enslaved. We'd rather lose. We'd rather take the risk, We'd rather try and see how it will go before we consider bringing in black enslaved men and women. So guys, thank you so much for tuning to my channel once again to watch this video. I major on black history. So on this video, I was trying to just get to understand the Second Amendment bill, and there is no a better person like the professor who just explained everything in black and white and made us understand that this Second Amendment has been made against the black folk. The good example she gave of Philando Castile, and how he was murdered as he was trying to explain that he has a licensed arm. This Second Amendment is not working for black folks in the US. She really tried to explain to us since time, like 400 years ago, the roots of when black people were being enslaved and the white folks were afraid of including them in their army. So guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Kindly do consider subscribing to this channel for amazing black history content. And guys, I am so grateful for the support so far. I do not take it for granted. Kindly do consider liking this video so that it can be recommended to your friends and family. And lastly guys, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel and also support me through super thanks down below, and I'd be so grateful. So guys, thank you, and see you all in my next video. Oh guys, before we leave, kindly comment down below. We need to learn from each other. Bye bye.